Good afternoon. We would like to welcome you again to our fifth and last Lunch and Learn. On behalf of the City of Asheville and the MLK Association of Asheville, we would like to welcome you. My name is Dr. Joseph Fox. I'm the event planner, coordinator, go by a lot of different titles. We have been delighted with the turnout all week to several events. So this year, this is the first year that the MLK Association has taken on the contract with the City of Asheville to produce Juneteenth. And as such, we wanted to make sure we were as inclusive as possible with all of Asheville and all the different communities. And so we were very intentional with these lunch and learns to hold them at different locations throughout Asheville, the community centers, so that people from other areas, other communities would hopefully visit with each other. And so we have been just pleased to try to reach as many communities, unify our communities. Asheville tend to be one of those places where we tend to stay in our own little community. And so our intentions were to really not only honor Juneteenth and the freedom and liberation that came from Juneteenth and the history of that, but also to unify Asheville, Black and white communities. And so we are just pleased to continue that legacy around celebration, honoring, and remembering. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. I'm going to let them introduce themselves as they present. They'll present probably 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. To my right is Linda Brown as well, and she told me that I was going first tonight. My name's Drew Reisinger. I'm your Buncombe County Register of Deeds. Thank you to the Martin Luther King Jr. Association, David, Orlean, Dr. Fox, and other board members. Thank you. I'm consistently impressed with what y'all achieve for this community and bringing people together and for the education uplifting of this community. Thank you. I'm also really excited to see the county and the city start to take Juneteenth seriously. Councilwoman Kim Roney, thank you for your dedication to making this holiday a real holiday and putting the funding in to make this a success. I'm so excited to see the real support that is actually coming from the city and the county to recognize this holiday as it should be celebrated. So thank you. Roughly a decade ago, my friend Deborah Miles from the Center for Diversity Education saw that there's this young new Register of Deeds who came into office, and she's like, cool, there's new opportunities that we can partner. And I was getting to know my role, and she had come to me to ask if she could borrow some records of slavery for an upcoming exhibit at UNC Asheville. And I had told her, well, we have birth records and death records and marriage records and property records. We don't have records of slavery. And she was quick to correct me, as Deborah does. And she let me know that because slaves were considered property, the property records contained all the records of slavery in Buncombe County's history. And so that was the moment I realized that we had a lot of work to do. These documents have been kept on a dusty courthouse shelf for a long time, and we realized that we were going to bring them to light. About a decade before that, Deborah had a conversation with her husband one night, who happens to be a North Carolina real estate attorney, about these documents he had found in the basement of the Register of Deeds office vault. And he's like, there were slave records trading slaves back and forth. And she happened to be a woman who could pull people together, and she got a grant to bring these young African-American high school students together to spend the summer in the vault of the Register of Deeds office. Not a summer of fun, but of grueling, tedious work. And these young students built the basis of this database that we now have today. So each of these bills of sales were put into a folder, and then when they were done with it, there's this impressive collection of deeds that were transferring one human to another human in bills of sale. Can y'all hear me in the back? Okay. Good job on sound to y'all. You guys did good. But since that time, there's been just a whole lot of technology that we've been able to put into place in the Register of Deeds office. And I realized right away that this really wouldn't be that difficult for us to finish digitizing this record set and make them easily available so they can all live in one place online. So if your ancestors were potentially enslaved in Buncombe County and you didn't still live in Buncombe County, you wouldn't have to drive all the way here to come research these records. And what we didn't realize was we were the first Register of Deeds office in the country to digitize these records and make them freely available. Thank you. It was a great effort and a good step towards transparency. But the longer they were available and out there, we'd talk to genealogists and others who'd used the system, and we realized that it wasn't that useful. Come on in. It wasn't that useful, not in the sense that the content wasn't important, but that because slaves were bought and sold across county lines and state lines, tracking their sales in just one county wasn't that useful. So, come on in, friends. So what we quickly realized was that we needed to do more. There needs to be a national database of slave records. There needs to be a list of names of those who were enslaved, and it does not exist. We're nowhere close to having something like that exist. Myself and Deborah Miles and our friends in the state archives who we've been working with for a little while met with the folks at UNC Greensboro. UNC Greensboro has been working on some fun stuff over the past decade where they've been focusing on runaway slave ads and slave petitions. So they already had a database and the technological resources potentially host something bigger. So we essentially asked them if they'd be willing to host a larger database of slave deeds. So together we partnered with the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, and we requested a big grant from the National Archives. If I was telling you a longer story, I could tell you the multiple attempts we'd made at these major grants and failed. But this group of people and the background UNC Greensboro had in making digital records available was enough for the National Archives to trust us. And several months later, we heard that we'd won a major grant from the National Archives. It was a big deal. It was only enough to get the project started, but North Carolina was on its way to becoming the first state in the country to have bills of sale freely available for people to research. A couple years later now, we have a fully functional free website called People Not Property that currently houses material and data from 17 North Carolina counties, including Buncombe. It includes over 13,000 documents referencing 69,000 people who were enslaved. It's been a learning curve as we've tried to go through this process. And we do have a very functional website now, and it wasn't always that way. Last week, this hasn't hit the news yet, but we just learned that our project won another federal grant. It's an LSTA grant to keep this project going. The new grant will allow us to expand into Onslow County, Wilkes County, and Halifax County, and potentially Allegheny, Ashe, and Northampton. We're currently finishing up work now on the last grant that we received, which includes Burke County records, Rockingham County records, Yadkin, And the big one is Bertie. These eastern North Carolina counties that were agricultural, the numbers coming out of there are heartbreaking, and the resources to digitize those records are minimal. These largely minority counties that are now small in nature and still agricultural, they don't have urban centers bringing in enough money to digitize them, but there are so many records that exist there for people who want to do ancestral research. And now they finally are going to have the funding they needed the federal funding to get over that hump. They weren't going to be, their register of deeds, even if they were as progressive as I am, they weren't going to take the effort on because they didn't have the money from small Bertie County funds. So all that is going to exist. The Bertie County records are almost done, and it's going to be a treasure trove of information for a genealogist. My hope is that this North Carolina-based project is just the beginning. I would like to see an online database of slave records from the entire country in one place that's freely available, so not just Ancestry.com where only the wealthy can pay for it. Across the country, these records are still sitting on dusty courthouse shelves, and we need to make these documents more accessible, not only for genealogical purposes, but so that we can have a better understanding that impact slavery had on our community, and so that we can share these lessons for generations to come. Come on in, Roy. Save one right up front for you.
Hi, everybody. Costa Rica coffee.
In the late 1930s, the Library of Congress realized there was still a small number of people who survived slavery and were still alive to tell their story. So the Library of Congress sent out archivists throughout the nation to find those who were still able to tell their stories of what they remembered from the days of being enslaved. One of the few stories that we have from Western North Carolina was recorded just a mile and a half from here. It was on the steps of Sarah Gudger's house over in Kenilworth, right next to a cemetery you might hear more about, literally like a couple houses down, I think.
On Dalton Street.
On Dalton Street, that's right. I've had a crush on this sweet woman for years now, and I love showing her picture. The woman who had the opportunity to interview Sarah described her as small in structure, about 5 feet tall. Thanks, Roy. Aunt Sarah is rather rounded in the face and body. Her milk chocolate face is surmounted by short, sparse hair, almost milk white. She is somewhat deaf, but understands the questions asked her, responding with animation. She walks with one crutch, being lame in the right leg. Aunt Sarah was eager to talk, but needed little prompting. The project came full circle for us when we were compiling all these records, and I came upon this slave deed for Sarah. It read, State of North Carolina, Buncombe County. Know all men by these presents that J. Abner Jarvis of the state and county aforesaid have to this day bargained and sold unto Andrew Hemphill, a certain Negro slave named Sarah, aged 20 years old, for the consideration of $250. Sarah's narrative is out there. It's freely available on the Library of Congress's website, and it's also on the Register of Deeds website. If you want an assignment for the weekend as we go into Juneteenth to better understand what slavery looked like and what freedom looked like in her perspective, listen to her story. It's absolutely impactful, it's heartbreaking, and you'll fall in love with her too. Part of the goal of this project was to shed light on those who were enslaved and to make available the names of those who've been forgotten by time. Registers of deeds and clerks of court across the country have an incredible repository of genealogical information that are public records. These records of slavery need to be freely and digitally available for the public. We have to make public records more publicly available. And I will stand on the mountaintop and yell it until people hear me. But we've got public records that aren't accessible, and it should be a crime. I don't see any members of the press in here, so I'm going to tell you about one more thing real quick. It's not necessarily a secret, but
We can edit it out.
it's fine. It's not necessarily a secret. I just we're planning a big statewide rollout, and I don't want to step on those toes. Do we have some Black family genealogists in the house? I know Orlean's done a lot of genealogy history. Are there other family genealogists who know your family's history? Yeah, of course you do, Andrea. Thank you. Thank you. If you are an African American and you have researched any of your ancestry, you know how incredibly challenging it is to find anything prior to the Civil War. There's this wall that genealogists talk about, and it for so long has felt insurmountable to figure out what was actually happening prior to emancipation. So there's this one record set that I feel like gives incredible clues and hints towards Black genealogists who are trying to find their ancestors. Essentially, before the Civil War started, North Carolina said slaves could not marry at all. They just weren't legally allowed to marry. North Carolina lawmakers have told our citizens in multiple cases over the centuries who people can and cannot love. And those bigoted laws, we know, have never stopped anyone from having families or from having loving relationships. After the Civil War was over, they had to recognize that Black people were people. And they also had to recognize that they had to recognize their relationships. And they didn't have a way of doing that, so they demanded that folks who had been cohabitating come to the courthouse and record how long they've been in relationships for. In my opinion, it's kind of like a backhanded way of saying marriage records. But for genealogists and researchers today in this modern era, we're left with this robust list of names of those who survived slavery and the last name that they took directly after emancipation, which is like this incredible genealogical gift. And they often say how long the couple had been thumbing their nose at the state of North Carolina for the sake of love. It's my favorite record that we have in the Register of Deeds office. It's freely available on our website at buncombecounty.org if you want to find it. But once again, these records are only as good as the county is big. There's an interesting story about in Buncombe County, our cohabitation records were lost for more than a century. And one day there was this family historian from Asheville who was down in the state archives going through a random record set. It happened to be a road docket book talking about how the roads were going to be laid out in Buncombe County. And she was a curious person, and she, after 30 pages or so that were blank, she made it to the back of the book, and there was a whole nother record set that no one had seen in a century. And essentially what had happened was they had turned the book, county government trying to pinch pennies. I can appreciate it, but come on. They turned over this road docket book and said, there's some free pages here. And they made that their cohabitation book of these marriage records. It has only been recent that Buncombe County cohabitation records are available and found. They're now digitized. This record set unlocked another 464 names for genealogists to uncover their Buncombe County ancestors. And so there are flaws and there are good things and bad things about every record set. Slave deeds are only first names. A slave named Sarah, 20 years old. This has first and last name. It gives who they're married to. It gives dates. This is an incredibly useful record set, and it's all cleanly together in one place. So Deborah Miles and I had been hassling state archives for, I don't know, 5-7 years as we do. And we said, like, these records exist in every county that was a county in 1866. Thank you, Linda. And realistically, most registers of deeds don't know this record set exists in their office, but the state could lead on this. The state could easily make this available in one place as a digital database. So when Darren Waters from UNC Asheville got the nod from Governor Cooper to be the new state historian, we realized we had an opportunity to light a fire under state archives. Derek is the most knowledgeable among us, and he already knew the record set, and he's like, yeah, we're gonna push this through and we'll make it happen. And it has. With Darren's help and some extra mileage on my car, tracking down these records in other counties who didn't know they existed, I'm excited to report that this project is going to be freely available this summer on the State Archives website in its entirety, which is cool. So while we're 17 counties in on slave deed database, which is a massive repository of all these hidden records, this cohabitation record set is going to be available this summer. And if anyone wants to start getting their feet wet in your own family genealogy, it's an incredible place to get started. And we'd be glad to help you as well. If you guys want help from the Register of Deeds office or from the Old Buncombe Genealogical Society, special collections in the Pack Memorial Library also has a lot of resources available. Part of what I wanted to get out today was I do think it's possible, and for a long time Black people didn't have easy access to records, and I think that is slowly changing. And I think North Carolina is truly going to, following Buncombe County's lead, North Carolina is going to be the best state in the country to find enslaved ancestors' records, and hopefully the country will follow suit. That's all I've got. I'm going to turn it over to Linda, and then let's open it up to questions, as both of our worlds are going to dovetail nicely, I think.
My name's Linda Brown. I'm a member of Old Buncombe County Genealogy Society, which is we were founded in 1970. We have about 250 members. We're totally self-supporting. Before I was a volunteer at Old Buncombe, I worked for Buncombe County Tax Office. I was in charge of the mapping and the real estate divisions. The real estate's the ones that do the revals. I was in charge of revals back in the day. Worked there 27 years. So after I retired, I started doing my first love, which is history, genealogy, and research. Research is my favorite thing to do. And Old Buncombe does a lot of things, the Genealogy Society. This is a book that we published many years before anybody even thought about putting it online. This is the cohabitation records for Buncombe County. Somebody in our office went to the originals and copied them. Another thing we do is this is a history of a local church. We have a print shop and a bookstore, and we have 7,000 books in our library. Our library is open to the public, and some of the books we have are these. We also have high school annuals. For example, we have 4 high school annuals from Allen High School. Somebody found them at Goodwill and donated them to our library. And they are a treasure to have. We also have some from Asheville High, from Stevens Lee, Mars Hill. We have annuals from all over Western North Carolina. And we also have city directories, other things, and we have maps. Well, the way I got, like I said, one of the things I did when I worked for Buncombe County was I was on the Abandoned Cemetery Committee. And on that committee, I met a lady named Ruth Dilling, who was president of Old Buncombe Genealogy Society at the time. And when I retired, she goes, I need you to come over here and volunteer. So I did. Well, I have 2 passions, churches and cemeteries. every genealogist does. And family histories. But I started out writing a history of St. John A. Baptist Church, which is in Kenilworth, which adjoins South Asheville Cemetery. Well, as I was getting it, I have mountains of information, and I'm almost finished with the book on St. John A. But before I got too far into it, I realized instead of the South Asheville Cemetery being a chapter, it needed to be a book itself. So that's how this book came about. I spent 5 years doing research, trying to find, this is a map that Warren Wilson College did that shows the burials at South Asheville Cemetery. They did it with something similar to ground-piercing radar. They found 1,961 graves. I've found over 2,000 people that I feel are buried in the cemetery. And the difference between their number and my number is the fact that some people were buried on top of each other. The first burial, we don't really know when the first burial was, but the property belonged... before I started writing about South Asheville Cemetery and who was buried there, I had to find out who wasn't buried there and where people were buried during the time. South Asheville Cemetery burials took place there sometime between mid-1800s to 1943. The last burial was a man who died in World War II while he was in the Navy. And he's the last burial that was made at South Asheville Cemetery. So anyway, so this book is named Search for the Forgotten, and that's the hardest part about writing a book is trying to decide on the title. So I got the title, but it's about much more than South Asheville Cemetery. I did research on the first African-American funeral directors, how people were buried, what the procedures were, what the practices were, where they were buried. And from my research, and when I went into this, the first thing I did was I read everything I could on South Asheville Cemetery. But I went into it with no preconceived ideas, not trying to prove anything, just letting the research and the facts speak for themselves. And the first thing I found out was the very, very, very first burials of African Americans were on family cemeteries. The people who had the slaves, when they died, they had a place to bury them on their land. That's also where they buried their family, was buried on their land too. Usually not in the same place, but sometimes close. It just depended on the family. Some of these cemeteries are still in use. There are a few families, I think Chambers Family Cemetery, which is I think it's in Ivy officially. It's still available for descendants of the Black Chambers family. And so anyway, that's what I did. I found all the cemeteries where people could be buried and were buried, and I found as many names as I could. Well, in the city of Asheville, there were no public cemeteries until 1885. And when you go back as early as 1800, there were no churches either. So people were buried on usually private land. Newton Cemetery was originally a school, and eventually a school and a church. And then when churches formed, they started having little cemeteries. Well, when Riverside Cemetery opened in 1885, the City of Asheville passed a rule: no more burials in the City of Asheville except at Riverside, which was at that time called Asheville Cemetery. That was the original name of Riverside. So we had, and all of the, First Baptist, Nazareth's First Baptist, Central Methodist, they all had cemeteries. The bodies were moved to Riverside. Riverside has excellent records. They were very helpful to me in my research, because I would ask, okay, do you have this person on your list? Nope. Well, they're buried somewhere else then. So we have to find. And then West Asheville Cemetery, which is now Green Hills, opened in 1901. Violet Hill opened which is still active and very well run and has excellent records also. So does Green Hill. They have excellent records. It opened in 1932. Sunset Cemetery opened in 1942. South Asheville closed in 1943. They had the last burial in 1943. And, you could say, okay, then why did it close? It could be there were more options. There's a lot, we really don't know. There's been oral history, the city closed it, but I couldn't find any evidence of that with the city, that they ever had anything to do with South Asheville Cemetery closing. They could have, and I just haven't found the documentation yet. So I started looking at the gravestones at South Asheville Cemetery. There are 82 gravestones. The oldest one goes to 1880, and I'll tell you a little bit about his family in a second. Then, and it's wonderful, all this stuff is aligned. I'm so thankful. The Genealogy Society and all genealogists are so thankful to Drew for what he's done to help us find information. And it's just beyond what any other register of deeds has done that we know of. Okay, found the list of all of the gravestones that are at South Asheville, took pictures of all of them, did research on the families, and tried to find some information about them. Then I looked at one of the things, if you're a genealogist, that you really deal with a lot of census records. Well, the census records also, there's what's called mortality records, which lists the people who died the year before the census. Some of the slaves that were owned by the Smith McDowells that died, we know they're buried at South Asheville Cemetery because George Avery, who had been a slave of the McDowells, said, that was his oral history, he took care of the cemetery until his death in 1938. He was born in 1845, and he died in 1938. George Avery's buried in the cemetery. His first and second wives and his son are all buried in the cemetery. All of them had grave markers. At one time, his first wife's grave marker has been removed, which, according to my good source, George Gibson, there were a lot more grave markers, but they've been moved, stolen over the years. Who knows why? Lack of respect for the dead is my main thing. I think that's just a pandemic of things that we just don't respect the dead. So the next thing I did was we do not have death certificates before September 1909, but the death certificates are online on Ancestry. Ancestry is another thing you can use at Old Buncombe. We have it free for the public. I went on Ancestry and I looked at every single death certificate for Buncombe County from September 1909 to the end of 1943. I separated all of the African American deaths into a spreadsheet. Then I separated them. On the death certificate, it tells you where they're buried. I separated them by where they were buried, and I have this database at home. I've got where everybody was buried. I've got their first name, their last name, their cause of death, when they were born, when they died, what their occupation was, where they were born, what their parents' name was, and who was the funeral director. I have all that on a spreadsheet. So then after I did that, then I took separated out just the ones for South Asheville Cemetery. Now, there have been some other people that have asked me about who's buried at other cemeteries. It's on my database. If people ask me, I give them the list. I've already done the work. No use anybody else, doing the same thing. And eventually that database will be at Old Buncombe in our records. I haven't gotten it there yet. Okay. And so the South Asheville Cemetery, before 1865, it was a burial ground for Smith McDowell slaves and their families. After 1865 till about 1900, it was primarily the former slaves of the family and the people who lived right around that South Asheville area. Then in 1890, the McDowell family gave a deed for the cemetery to the AME Zion Church. All of the people who belonged to the AME Zion Church were somehow connected to the McDowells, as far as I can tell. There was the George Avery and his family, the Ragsdales, the Baileys, the Rowleys, Claytons, Pattons, and there might be another family or two. Okay. So anyway, I've got my list. I made my book, and one of the things that I wanted to do in writing the book about the cemetery was to write about some of the early people. James Bailey was born in 1816. His wife Rebecca, they're in the cohabitation book. She was born in 1826. They married in 1842. They had at least 7 children, and when freedom came, they were slaves of the McDowell family. They lived, after in 1870 census, the family lived right next door to Sarah and William McDowell. They purchased land from 12 acres from the McDowells. If you're on Biltmore Avenue, where the old Coke plant is, those of us who are from here would know where the old Coke plant was, or Matthews Ford. Their 12 acres was behind that, and it went up to where, and part of the land was now Lee Walker Heights. They had 12 acres there. It was called Bailey Hill. Now, Mr. Bailey died in 1880 something or 1891, I can't remember, but he has a tombstone. All of his family had tombstones. Now, his family either died, there's probably no descendants of that family left in Asheville, but they're one of the original black families. The last surviving relative that I chased down was a grandson who was an artist who left the United States to go study art in Berlin, Germany in 1914. I can't find him after that. Don't know if he stayed in Germany, if he came back, got caught up in the war. We don't know, but that's the last Bailey descendant I could find. The family, James Bailey and his wife Rebecca, gave all of their children at least an acre of the land, and they had one grandchild who was the daughter of, and like I said, all that family history is in my book. They had one grandchild who they raised as a daughter after her mother died. Her mother died 1865 or 1866. So that was the Bailey family. And then, of course, we had the Claytons, and the Claytons, most of them have moved away. George Avery's family, like I said, all of them were the original, and they were all buried at South Asheville. Well, people started moving into South Asheville, after the railroad came to Asheville. We had a large migration of people, and a lot of people moved here and settled in that South Asheville area because it was between Biltmore, where you could work for Vanderbilt, and Asheville, where there were plenty of jobs in Asheville, and it was both within walking or streetcar distance. So a lot of people settled there, and they went to the AME Zion Church, or St. John A. Baptist Church was started in 1914. And then those two churches took care of the cemetery for a long time, and then just gradually the cemetery fell in disrepair. That can happen to any cemetery. I have that particular problem. I'm on the board of the cemetery where my family's buried. We have a real issue. We're all dying off. We're getting old. We're dying off. Our kids have moved away. And the cemetery where my family's buried is very small. It adjoins Sunset Cemetery, matter of fact. And our burials go back to 1830, 1840, where West Chapel was there. That was the church that was there. And then after it left, that's what happens. In the old days, we had Decoration Day. We took care of the cemeteries on certain days. Most people now do not do that. And unless you have somebody buried in a perpetual care cemetery, it's up to the family pretty much to take care of the graves. And that's what happened at South Asheville. The people moved away. Oh, one of the things I did was during my research is also did statistics. And you say, well, why is there only 82 graves and there's 2,000 burials? Well, 1,000 of those are children. Over 500 were stillborn. We did not have cremation in western North Carolina until 1975, and that was in Hendersonville. And so cremation, people used to bury the stillborn babies. And so there's over 500 stillborn babies buried in South Asheville Cemetery, and over 600 children under the age of 1. Most people did not get a tombstone for their child. And that's one thing. The other thing is, as the 20s and 30s, everybody was just barely trying to survive. I think it's interesting that the Bailey family, most of whom died in the 1880s and 1890s, they have tombstones. Oh, James Vester Miller's mother is buried at South Asheville, his 3 brothers and his sister. They all had markers. At one time, his mother's is still there. I think his sister's is still there, but his brothers all shared a marker, and it's gone. Like I said, a lack of respect for the dead, taking markers. It's just, to me, beyond my comprehension to steal a grave marker, but that's what people do. So I have a real passion, as you can probably tell, for cemeteries and abandoned cemeteries, and we shouldn't forget these people. They were, most of the people who are buried at South Asheville just lived a normal life, went to work, took care of their families, went to church every week, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, and just lived life. And they've been forgotten because their families have moved away, or because of, well, that's primary, either they died without any descendants. And genealogy is difficult. I love Dr. Gates's program, Finding Your Roots. It would be really nice if you could do that in an hour. If you could find everything he finds in an hour, it would be really nice. But what he finds is wonderful, but it's probably thousands of hours of genealogy work. And most genealogists start at $250 an hour. So you're talking about a lot of, if you don't do the work yourself, and you pay somebody else, it's a lot of money. But if you do your work yourself, it's very rewarding. And one of the other thing that the genealogy societies do is we go to cemeteries and walk off the cemetery and mark, okay, here's a tombstone, here's an unmarked grave. This is what the tombstone says. And you go all through the cemetery. We've been doing that for 50 years. And that's important work. We just found a new cemetery out in Candler. None of the graves are marked anymore. They might have some field stone, but there are people who remember who was buried there. So we sent it to you to add to your cemetery map. So we're trying to make sure, Drew has a great cemetery map on his website too. So we're trying to document who was buried there and something about their lives. But anyway, that's all I have to say.
We want to thank Drew and Linda. If you have questions, I'm going to ask that you come at least halfway up. We'll pass you the microphone, and then whoever it's directed to, we will pass them the microphone.
I have a question. My name is Andrea Clark, and my relative, Annie Mae Miller Bolden, and Juanita, her daughter, they told me about a relative who lived around Mountain Street. Her name was Daisy. She was a clerk, and she had property that the city took for urban renewal. The city was calling about where she was and about the property. So they obviously took some property from her. I met Now, this was my father's brother Norman, who was in the Army, and they went to Kansas, and it took me a while to find them, because the family didn't know where they were. At any rate, I was in touch on Ancestry with my cousin, who was her grandmother was Daisy. Daisy happened to be, her name is Daisy Morris, and Daisy happened to be went to Shaw, and she was a music teacher. But anyway, they lived in Colorado. Actually, that's where she landed up. So I think I talked to Drew one time to say, what happens to that land that is owned by those people through, that is taken from with urban renewal? Does that land stay? Does the money from whoever they sold it to, is that there for her to come to get? Or that's my question. Is it clear? I hope so.
Kim, you want to speak on behalf of the city there? You guys have money available?
I can say that thanks to the Community Reparations Commission, if there are members here, tremendous gratitude. There's a great deal of work ahead. I believe that reparations are necessary and possible. The answer, unfortunately, I feel it's important to say, is the answer is not yet. But the yet is the important part, and that's the work we have ahead of us.
Okay, we have time for a couple more quick questions.
I think I was out at the South Asheville Cemetery about maybe a month or so ago, just walking around. And I was in Africa 5 years ago, and I'm going back. Can I take some of that soil back to Africa as symbolic? And so that's one of the projects I'm saying. I got to go back to Africa. I'm going back. And I want to go get a couple of vials of South Asheville, of Slave Cemetery, just some of the dirt around the graves, and take it back to Africa. So that's a project. Anybody want to help me with it? Come on.
I do want to say that some countries don't let you bring nothing in from, whether it's fruits, vegetables, or dirt. So you got to be.
Never know what germs are in the dirt.
Well, and we have a group of young people from Word on the Street with us. They've been with us all week, so give them a hand. Because our hope is within our young people, so they may be interested in helping you with that project, not putting words in your mouth. But they're also doing a project, a mural with, and I don't remember his name. Okay, I'm not even going to try. But so they may be asking questions. They are asking around what does equity means to you. And so the mural is going to end up with some of the research that they've been doing this week. Okay, we have time for one more question.
Can I bring up the South Asheville Cemetery Association? I'm always glad to have help. I mean, it's an enormous amount of work has gone in to clean up the cemetery so it looks like what it does today, and it's an ongoing thing. I mean, if you stop cleaning it, all of the weeds and things will take it back over. So that they were always, I'm sure, would be glad to have help.
And I would just say, those of you that have these special projects, because I asked what's the next steps, reach out to colleges and universities that have student groups that part of their function has to be a service project. And so it may be that they will take on some of these special projects as part of their organizational service project. We have time for one more question.
Thanks. I've been trying to use the database a little bit, playing in it, and have found some amazing things already. I mean, like, y'all, there was patenting them after 1866. They tried to put a bill through for voluntary re-enslavement or something. Yeah, it's really weird, some of the stuff that goes on. But anyhow, my question is that database searchable? like I'm with St. Matthias Church, if I wanted to see people who had been in St. Matthias who were buried around the town before Violet Hill was around, could I find that there?
So, death certificates. If you're talking about what we have available at the Register of Deeds office, death certificates are searchable by like last name and first name. You wouldn't necessarily be able to narrow it down by cemetery, but my friend Linda Brown has this secret database of everyone who is buried in a certain place, and that might be coming online at the Buncombe County Genealogical Society in the very near future.
How far back did these people die?
1860. The church was founded in 1867.
The church records you best place. There were no death certificates required in North Carolina until 1909, September 1909. And even then, a lot of people didn't bother because it was just, it's one more thing government wants me to do, I'm not going to do it. So the other thing is the City of Asheville had a requirement that if you died in the City of Asheville, they wanted to know where you were going to be buried, and that was from 1892 to 1909. Might be on that, but you'd have to know the person's name and about when they died, but the church records are probably your best bet.
One thing I just want to leave y'all with is like some hope that like genealogical work is challenging, but I do think there are a lot of resources available, and I guess I just want to encourage y'all to consider finding your own family's past and trying to learn those stories and be your family genealogist. If you're sitting in this room today, I know you care, and you should find your family's history, and you might even be like David King and figure out where your family ends up being family with Orlean Simmons, and that's pretty incredible find. So there is so much out there. There are free resources available in the bottom of Pack Library called Special Collections. They've got free access to Ancestry.com and newspapers.com, as does the Old Buncombe Genealogical Society, who also has some incredible folks who are willing to help you find your stuff. I'm willing to help you find stuff to a degree. I'm not a genealogist outside of my family, but if people have questions or trying to figure out how to get started, we'd love to help you get started finding your family's ancestry. So don't hesitate to ask me or my office questions, or Linda and the Old Buncombe Genealogical Society questions.
And write your family history. Preferably write it, if you're not, I wrote my life story for my son and my grandson. You need to do that for your descendants, and you need to write the rest. And when you write the book, you need to donate a copy to Old Buncombe, so we'll have it for other people to use for research. We also have classes. We have a DNA group that meets online Zoom once a month. We also have a writers group that meets once a month on Zoom to help you write your family history. Those are, it's not, one of the big losses we have as a people in general is that our grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents didn't write it down. Used to, before TV, we sat on the porch and listened to them. We haven't done that since television. So these stories are being lost, and it like I said, it's a big hole. We need to fill that hole. We need to do two things. We need to write our family histories, and we need to take care of our cemeteries.
Thank you all for coming.
I'm going to give the final word to Aisha, my boss.
It's just a question. One of the reasons why I just shy away from genealogy is because when I'm on the internet, I read these stories about how people like go and do their genealogy and then somebody gets arrested, or it's used as criminology behind, like if you do the DNA test and stuff like that. Yeah. So can you just give us some tips?
And when you have your DNA tested, you can say, I don't want it to be used for that. Okay. But where this came from was the Green River Killer. One of his relatives, their DNA matched where he had killed, raped, and mutilated this woman. It wasn't the guy's DNA, but they knew it was in that male line. All men descendants have the same Y chromosome. And so that's where this came from. But if you get your DNA checked on any of the major DNA groups like Ancestry or Family Tree, you can opt out of that and not share it with.
Let's give our presenters a hand, and thank you for coming, and have a blessed day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Whoa, wonderful.